у нас буде доповідь англійською мовою. Скажіть, чи всі мають гарнітури для перекладу? Хто не має, підніміть, будь ласка, руки. Дівчата, хлопці, волонтери, зверніть, будь ласка, увагу. Тут в перших двох рядах є у мене люди без гарнітури. Там теж пані без гарнітури. Давайте скористаємося цією хвилинкою для того, щоб всі вже були готові до сприйняття інформації англійською мовою, точніше, завдяки перекладу. Так, хто ще не має? Сюди, будь ласка. І там в задніх рядах теж. Так. Все, всіх побачили? Всі з гарнітурами? Чудово. Тоді ми можемо переходити до наступної доповідачки. Це докторка Меган Мопс, президентка фундації РТ Везермен та директорка Центру американської безпеки і захисту в організації Independent Women. Увага на екран.
Good afternoon. I so wish I was there with you in person in Kyiv, but I am delighted I get to still participate. A very generous thank you to the sponsors of today. So for my part, what I want to talk about today is a tension. The tension between two truths that don't always sit comfortably together. The first is that war wounds people in ways that demand serious clinical attention and serious clinical treatment. And the second, that most of the people who come home from war are not in the clinical sense, in the diagnostic sense, broken. Both of these things are true, and the question of how we hold them at the same time will shape how Ukraine treats this generation of defenders for the next 50 years. I want to start with a U.S. Marine, a special operations reconnaissance veteran I worked with years ago in therapy, who said something to me that I've never been able to quite shake or forget about. He said, for me, PTSD was just the realization I'd never be that cool again. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what he was describing was not clinically diagnostic, it was not pathology, he wasn't having flashbacks, he wasn't avoiding crowded places, he was grieving. He was grieving the loss of himself, the loss of feeling like he mattered, that his life pulsed with meaning, that he was bonded, committed to something bigger, grander than himself, that he was capable of aggressive, decisive action, and that he was a change agent in his own life. And the moment he left combat, the moment he left war, all of that evaporated. The diagnosis his doctors gave him, PTSD, was the only language available to them and to him. But that diagnosis didn't actually fit his experience. So I've spent my life navigating that mismatch, both as a combat veteran myself and as a clinical psychologist. And I want to make a claim that we may be uncomfortable with. And when I say we, I mean the global community of trauma researchers, clinicians, veteran service bureaucracies, nonprofits, and political messaging machines. Unfortunately, we have turned trauma after war into a credential. We have built entire industries around the idea that to come home from war is to be broken, and that narrative is not only inaccurate, it's corrosive. When we treat trauma as the only authentic way to return from war, we do two things at once. We alienate veterans who don't feel broken. We tell them their experience just doesn't count. And then we stigmatize the ones who do feel broken. We tell them their wound is the proof of their service in war. So what we end up doing is we collapse a vast, complex range of human reaction into a single diagnostic category. And in doing so, we substitute empathy with clinical reductionism. There is a better name for what most veterans actually experience after war. I call it transition stress, and it is the psychic dislocation that comes not necessarily from trauma, but from the sudden loss of identity, structure, purpose, and belonging that often follows military service. In 2018, while I was at Columbia University my collaborator, George Bonanno, and I published a paper in Clinical Psychology Review called Beyond War and PTSD, the crucial role of transition stress in the lives of military veterans. It was the first major peer-reviewed article to name this construct systematically and to argue that mental health theory about veterans had focused so heavily on PTSD that it had missed the wider, more common experience that also predicted suicidality more than combat exposure. So 4 pillars structure this construct. Identity. Who am I when I am not the warrior, when I am not the defender? Structure. The architecture of every day, the chain of command, the mission, the schedule, gone overnight. Purpose. The mission that gave their days weight, that gave their existence meaning. And belonging. The brotherhood that does not always follow you home. Now here is where the data matters, because intuition tells us combat exposure equals trauma equals PTSD. But the research says something different. My collaborator, who I just mentioned, George Bonanno, did a meta-analysis of 54 studies of people exposed to potentially traumatic events, including combat, bereavement, disaster, injury. And he found that 65% of people followed what he calls a resilience trajectory, meaning they possessed few or no symptoms of psychopathology. 65% is not a fringe outcome. That's the majority. Resilience is the rule. PTSD is real, but it is the exception. In U.S. veteran populations specifically, the most commonly cited figures are roughly 20% who meet criteria for PTSD, but it is somewhere between 44 and 72% who experience meaningful transition stress. That gap between the 20% who fit this diagnostic box, and I will say that 20% is often overstated, the more approximate prevalence rate of PTSD in US veterans is actually around 12 to 13%. So that 12 and 13% difference between 44 and 72% who experience meaningful transition stress, that gap is where we have to do better here in the US, and where in Ukraine, I hope you get it right. Because these are 2 distinct trajectories. PTSD is what happens when specific traumatic events overwhelm the nervous system. Transition stress is what happens when the warrior defender identity dissolves on contact with civilian life. PTSD expresses itself through hypervigilance, intrusion, dysregulated arousal. Transition stress expresses itself through grief, drift, restlessness, loneliness, loss of meaning. And critically, they require different responses. PTSD demands clinical treatment. Transition stress demands the restoration of identity, structure, purpose, and belonging. And it's particularly important to recognize that transition stress can lead to substantial amounts of distress that predict suicidality more so than PTSD. The problem is it's not a diagnosis. And here is the part that no one really wants to say out loud. You can miss war and hate it at the same time. It's not clear-cut, it's not neatly done. And as the famous war journalist Sebastian Junger once wrote, combat isn't where you might die, though that does happen. It's where you find out whether you get to keep on living. Don't underestimate the power of that revelation. Don't underestimate the things young people will wager in order to play that game one more time. I've felt this myself. I've heard echoes of this from Ukrainian Defenders, former special operators, active special operators, and then I've heard fears from family members and clinicians. And I've even spoken to one member of parliament who asked me very frankly, is the solution to start private military companies? Because I don't know what else to do with men who are wired to fight. This is not a fringe sentiment and it's not a fringe concern. And it doesn't make those men or women who come back psychopaths or suicidal or ungrateful, because the drive toward war is not always about violence. Oftentimes, it's just about clarity, the ability to command life over death, to live with consequence, and to test the self against the limits of fear. The grief of leaving that bigness of yourself behind is not pathological, but it can be extraordinarily destabilizing when you realize you are now living what feels like a normal, unexciting, very small life. So Ukraine now stands on the precipice of this reckoning, at a scale no Western nation has faced in generations. And it means that the mental health burden on Ukrainian service members and families will outlast the war itself by decades. And we know this from experience here in the US. After Vietnam, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, that delayed treatment becomes chronic treatment. This is particularly true of post-traumatic stress disorder. The longer that PTSD goes untreated, the more entrenched it becomes. Early intervention dramatically improves long-term prognosis. So when I look at Ukraine right now, at the hundreds of thousands of veterans who will need to be reintegrated, who have all of these different trajectories, transition stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, which I don't talk about here, but is a substantially important topic, I do not necessarily see solely a clinical question. I see a national reconstruction priority. So when I think about that, when I think about the fact that this is a national reconstruction priority, I do hold the fact that the bulk of those returning, the bulk of those reintegrating are going to be on that transition stress trajectory, which requires very specific kind of holistic interventions that are spherical, not temporal, meaning that the expectation that veterans just automatically reintegrate and that it's done on a very specific timeline is short-sighted and foolish. It needs to be done holistically and recognize that most transition stress begins to appear 2 to 4 years after transition. But as we prioritize those that are struggling the most, this is the pivot I want to quickly make. When PTSD does take hold, which also oftentimes can appear many years after the initial encounter with that traumatic event, when that wound is genuinely clinical, it is real, it is debilitating, and it deserves serious treatment. And now there are frontier treatments that may change how and where we deliver that care. So I do want to spend the next several minutes moving a little bit away from transition stress to talk about a program that's been running there in Ukraine under the foundation I lead. And it encompasses 225 Ukrainian service members across multiple sites in Ukraine. And that's stellate ganglion block. So what is stellate ganglion block, or SGB? It is a procedural intervention. So there's a cluster of sympathetic nerves that sit in the neck at the level of the 6th and 7th cervical vertebrae. That cluster is central to the body's fight or flight response. So SGB itself is an ultrasound-guided injection of local anesthetic into that ganglion. It is oftentimes a single procedure, though it can also be done as a double procedure, and it takes minutes, not months. And the working hypothesis is that chronic PTSD is in part an autonomic arousal disorder, that the alarm system is just stuck on, blaring all the time. So SGB temporarily blocks the sympathetic overactivation and the symptoms that ride on that: hypervigilance, intrusive memory, sleep disturbance, and the persistent sense of threat. So understanding and knowing that, we looked at the 225 Ukrainian service members across all of these sites, and that led to the analysis of 144 that had completed paired baseline and the week 4 outcomes. And we used 4 validated instruments: PCL5 for post-traumatic stress disorder, PHQ-9 for depression, the GAD-7 for anxiety, and the clinician-administered HAM. What makes this study unusual, what makes what I would argue one of the most ecologically demanding PTSD assessments, is the setting. First off, it's in Ukraine during a full active war, and these service members were predominantly not veterans. The majority of them went back to fight on the front. Which makes this headline number even more striking, because what we saw was a mean or an average PCL5 reduction of 23.4 points. The average participant moved from a score of 41, which is well above the diagnostic threshold of 33 on the PCL5, to roughly 17, which is substantially below the threshold for diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Moreover, if we're looking at the Cohen's d, we found an effect size of 1.63. And for context, prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy, both which are considered the gold standard of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, deliver that effect size around 1.0 to 1.3 in controlled trials. SSRIs or medication come in even lower at 0.4 to 0.6. Now, the study is observational, it's not randomized, so we do have to interpret this with care, but the magnitude of this effect size makes complete placebo explanation implausible. More importantly than effect sizes, which do matter, and of course all of us as scientists, we obviously want the data to inform our care and for it to help drive meaningful improvement in how we're delivering care to those that are in our charge. But the most striking thing is that 84.7% of participants achieved clinically meaningful improvement by a reduction of 10 or more PCL5 points. And these were not marginal responses. 55%, so more than half, achieved 20-point reductions or more. Yes, there was a couple non-responders, about 6 individuals, but the most counterintuitive finding that we saw was that baseline severity predicted response. Meaning, the sicker the patient came in, the more they improved. 92% of patients with severe baseline PTSD, a PCL5 of 50 or higher, achieved meaningful improvement. So this is an argument for prioritizing something like SGB access for the most burdened and not reserving it as a last resort after other treatments have failed. But there was another observation that caught my clinical attention as well. Depression and anxiety fell too. So, if you can see here, PHQ-9 depression, again, effect size about 1.68, for the GAD-7, 1.49, the HAM-A, 1.66. What that means is that the effect size matches the primary PTSD outcome I just mentioned. And in standard practice, PTSD, depression, and anxiety are frequently comorbid. We know that. And treating one in isolation does often lead to limited benefit for the others. We also know that based on a clinical experience and the data. But the parallel improvement across all three, PTSD, depression, and anxiety, suggests that SGB is not targeting PTSD as a discrete condition. It is somehow modulating an underlying sympathetic nervous system substrate that all three disorders share. That is a different way of thinking about what these illnesses are. And here's what makes this operationally interesting for Ukraine specifically. Standard of care PTSD treatment, the things I just mentioned, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, well, those require 12 to 16 weeks of structured, cognitively demanding sessions. What we know in the US is also dropout rates are extremely high, and oftentimes symptoms are still very high. But it also requires removal from the operational environment. It requires stable infrastructure and skilled clinicians on site. Patient engagement and extended therapeutic processing is critically necessary in order to have the expected outcome and improvement. So quite frankly, it's incompatible with active deployment. But there's the possibility that SGB is different. A single or double procedural intervention, effective across diverse settings, field clinics, hospitals, and soldiers do not have to leave the operational environment to receive it. And the stigma profile is potentially lower. It reads more like getting a shot than going to therapy. Military medicine has long operated on the principle of forward care for physical injury, meaning we treat wounds close to the point of wounding rather than evacuating everyone to a distant facility unless necessary. SGB raises the possibility for the first time at scale of applying the same principle to psychiatric injury. Now, I do want to be careful here. This is not a cure-all. It's not a panacea. And as we all know with psychological intervention, there is no one-size-fits-all. But I am trying to argue for the fact that there are more tools that we can put in our toolkit than just the manualized therapies that we are often told are the gold standard. Because what we've found, especially with combat-related PTSD, is they are in fact not a gold standard at all. And in fact, oftentimes veterans don't want those therapies and they just aren't very effective. And I do want to be honest about the limits of all of the data I just presented. This again is an observational project or a program. There is no randomized control group, and some proportion of improvement is almost certainly natural recovery, placebo, and attention effects. And the 23.4 point reduction is likely inflated relative to what a controlled trial would show. But my point is that we should be excited and exploratory around the potential benefits of some of these treatments that simply aren't getting enough attention. Which brings me to the kind of final point. Well, then, so how do we build a system that holds everything that I just said to be true at once? The idea that, yes, there are going to be veterans that come home that are very sick from PTSD. And there are going to be some that will never be diagnosed with PTSD, but still experience high levels of distress related to their transition back into their new environment. Well, I'm going to give just 6 principles, and they apply, I believe, to Ukraine's reintegration mission specifically. 1, please expect resilience. Never assume that every veteran is broken. Build every system for strength as a default, not as the rare exception. 2, see the whole person. Veterans are not a monolith. Their stories, their capacities, and their needs differ. A single system will not work, but tailored support will. 3, reintegrate families. Veterans do not return home alone. Spouses carry burdens that still haven't really been named, and children do not understand everything that's happening around them. So reintegration is for the system the veteran returns to, not just the veteran themselves. 4, embed mental health support in primary care and daily life. Don't isolate it, don't talk about it as a separate thing, normalize it and embed it everywhere. 5, peer networks first. They work. Veterans trust other veterans, and they trust those who speak the same language and who have experienced the same thing. No one understands a veteran like another veteran. Use those programs and scale them effectively across every aspect of mental health and reintegration. And then finally, take risks beyond convention. I don't see this as risky necessarily. I see it as taking calculated, courageous steps towards providing new potential interventions for those who have already demonstrated courage. Because again, as I've said repeatedly throughout this presentation, our data demonstrating that these gold standard treatments work just simply isn't there. Be willing to embark on this journey with veterans to find new tools for your toolkit to provide the best possible outcomes for those who have already given so much. So again, most veterans returning home will not be broken. The system has to reflect that. If it doesn't, if we keep treating every returning defender as a diagnosis waiting to happen, we will fail the majority and stigmatize the minority simultaneously. And when PTSD does take hold, when the wound is genuinely clinical, we now have evidence generated in Ukraine under the hardest possible conditions that we may be able to treat it closer to the front. Not in 12 weeks of therapy in a distant hospital, in minutes, in a procedure that's compatible with the operational environment. That is remarkable. For the service members who are currently suffering, the urgency of this work is not abstract. It is a difference between effective treatment within weeks of psychological wounding and a lifetime of inadequately treated symptoms. So as clinicians, we are called to honor their return. We cannot romanticize their suffering, but we should expect resilience. We should expect growth. And then we can treat what is needed when it is needed, and we can truly tell a story of successful reintegration. Thank you so much. And again, I wish I was there with you all today.
Ми теж дякуємо докторці Мопс. Якщо у вас є запитання, то докторка з нами на зв'язку і можна їх поставити. Вона відповість прямо зараз наживо. Піднімайте, будь ласка, руки, кого я не бачу, щоб ми змогли поспілкуватися, якщо ви маєте запитання. Dr. Mobs, thank you. Thank you so much for participation, for sharing your experience. Here we're so, tired today in Kyiv because of air raid alert for the whole night and missile attack. That's why maybe we don't have a lot of questions here because people are a little bit sleepy, let me be honest. And maybe I can ask you about your thoughts if we talk about PTSD among civilians, because you know that in Ukraine it's not just about veterans and people who are next to the front line here in Kyiv. This night, I think some people were affected mentally, psychologically. What your data shows, how doctors, how specialists in this mental care sphere can work with civilians who have PTSD?
So first off, I am obviously very aware of the attacks last night. My team was on the ground in Kyiv, and so as always, my heart breaks when I'm not there, at least to be alongside of you all as this is happening. So I am glad that you are all there and safe, but I know that many are not. So please know that you are always in my hearts and my prayers as these things occur. It's a very good question related to the civilian prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder in a population like we're seeing in Ukraine. The reality is that military members are prepared for the realities of conflict. And so oftentimes they evidence more resilience because they've had some level of training, of preparation. And so naturally, they're going to have slightly more resilience than the broad population. So that doesn't mean that every civilian in every city that undergoes bombardment is going to develop PTSD. But certainly there's going to be substantial distress, which again is not a diagnosis, and it doesn't mean it doesn't need consideration or infrastructure to support, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's a full-blown diagnosis. But when it is a diagnosis, when someone does develop post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if it's based on a single incident, like it could be a specific bombardment, for example, then those treatments that I discussed, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, those do tend to be more efficacious than when you have cumulative trauma. The problem is, as you all know, it is cumulative. It's not just one bombardment, it's many bombardments over a long period of time. And so there is going to be a necessity of intervention, I think, at more broader scale than had previously anticipated. I will say, just though, as a note of resilience, there were many psychologists, many sociologists that anticipated after the Blitz on London during World War II that many civilians and many children were going to have very significant levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. But actually what they found was that wasn't true, because most Londoners brought their children into the subway with them, and they talked to them about meaning, about sacrifice, about purpose. And parents provided this protective layer around children, providing what felt like a safe environment, even if the reality is the external environment wasn't safe. I've been to Ukraine 34 times, I think, over the last couple of years. We see the same amount of purpose, meaning, protection from parents in Ukraine. So I will say I do anticipate some PTSD, but I don't anticipate significant levels that are off the charts or these prevalence rates are historic because of the resilience of Ukrainian parents and their ability to provide a sense of safety to the younger generation.
Dr. Mops, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and, of course, for your ongoing support of Ukraine. If we don't have questions here, we can say thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for this conversation.
Of course, thank you so much.